meeting number 8 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs with our review of the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Code for members. The committee is meeting today to continue this work, and I would like to remind all participants that no screenshots or photos of your screen is permitted. Before going into a couple more comments, I understand Mr. Duncan might have a friendly suggestion. Mr. Duncan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I may suggest in lieu of time that our witnesses just provide a 30-second, 60-second introduction of themselves and their roles. We have their opening statements, and anything else they want to provide, they can provide in writing, so we can maximize our Q&A. Thank you.
Is there any concerns with proceeding this way? Seeing none, thank you for that kind suggestion. I will just remind members that we all know the public health guidelines. I understand you've received them, so I'll take a nod to confirm I don't need to share this. Et lorsque vous avez la parole, veuillez parler lentement.
When you speak, please speak slowly and clearly. When you're not speaking, please place your microphone on mute, and I would remind you that all observations by MPs and witnesses must be directed to the chair. Therefore, I would now like to welcome our first panel today, Mr. Shimon Fogel, Dr. Anne Dance, Dr. Paul Thomas, who will each speak to the committee before the series of questions. Mr. Fogel, you have the floor.
Just to be in good faith, I will limit my comments to the following. We have submitted a number of different documents that we think are relevant to your committee's consideration, including some legal opinions that we have obtained over the last number of years. And I think that really does accurately reflect our position. I will say only this. We collectively have to be looking to every opportunity to excite and engage young people in the political process, in public service. And at a time when increasingly we're met with cynicism and disengagement, these kinds of programs are vital in providing a platform to excite, inspire, and engage young people. And we very much want to play our part in moving that objective forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Anne Dance?
Madame la Présidente, je vous remercie de...
Madam Chair, thank you for inviting me to give my viewpoint.
Opening statement, so I'll just summarize my recommendation. So first and most importantly, members reviewing the code should consider the impact of the advisory opinion on the accessibility of the Hill as a workplace. In my view, the advisory opinion has resulted in more unpaid people working for MPs. MPs have the right to staff their offices however they want. However, only a select group of people can afford to work for free and move from other regions of the country to do this. Second, the current advisory opinion does nothing to address the numerous unpaid interns working on the Hill, many with advocacy aims. If the goal is to address conflicts of interest, perhaps this should be a consideration. Third, MP staff should be offered training on these measures and any new measures, including advisory opinions. Fourth, there should be clearer and more transparent communication about the code and advisory opinion. And fifth, I recommend changing the language around paid interns. Characterizing young professionals as gifts is misleading and inappropriate, especially given the educational component of many internships. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Dance. Dr. Paul Thomas?
Madame la Présidente, je tiens à...
Madam Chair, I wish to thank the committee for having invited me to testify today.
And I've been the director of the Parliamentary Internship Program since July 2020. The Parliamentary Internship Program is a unique educational initiative that's jointly delivered by the Canadian Political Science Association in partnership with the House of Commons. It's been operating since 1970, and the structure was actually based on a report by the committee's predecessor back in 1969. What I would like to say is just to echo Dr. Dance's comments. The 2018 Advisory Committee had a number of impacts on the operation of internship programs. And so my three main points would be, that there should be a mechanism to ensure transparency in the operation of these programs, but that the system created by the advisory opinion has primarily served to limit access to quality paid internship opportunities at Parliament without necessarily achieving the desired gains in transparency. Second, that the mechanism of oversight established by the opinion is awkwardly structured and confusing for both MPs and those who operate internship initiatives. And finally, that access to internship experiences with MPs would be enhanced through the creation of a specific mechanism to ensure transparency of internship programs, rather than attempting to govern them through the existing provisions with the Conflict of Interest Code. And I also apologize to any members who read my prepared remarks and find the typos therein. I thought it was only for translation purposes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas. With that, we will start our first round of questions from members. They will be 6-minute rounds. Please, members, keep them tight just keep them tight. And we'll start with Mr. Viss, followed by Ms. Sahota, followed by Monsieur Terrier, et puis Madame Blaney.
And then Ms. Blaney.
The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And we touched upon this in the last meeting. Addressing the elephant in the room, I'm a parliamentary intern alumni, and I'm very, very proud of this program. This program gave me and young Canadians across this country one of the biggest legs up we could ever hope for. It brought together diverse Canadians from all sorts of different backgrounds and geographic regions of this country to learn and experience this place in a way that is unimaginable except through the parliamentary internship program. I am here today because of the parliamentary internship program and friendships with people like Ann Dance especially, and her brother Mark, who was in the program with me. I believe the Conflict of Interest Commissioner was wrong when he made this ruling. And I'd like Ann Dance, if she could, just to comment more extensively on the point she made that young interns are not gifts. And can you elaborate on that point, please, and the significance of that?
Through the chair, Mr. Viss, Dr. Dance.
Madam Chair, I'd like to thank the member for that question and his comments. I was an intern in 2008-2009, and I think there are two aspects to the problem, how troubling it is to have young people referred to as gifts. One is when you're a young person working on the Hill, there in 08-09, I think it's gotten better since then, that there is innuendo, there are comments. When you're a young woman, there's certain comments around being a young person on the Hill. Now, fortunately, the parliamentary internship program, there's agency, there's options. The interns choose the MPs, so they interview the MPs and they choose who they want to work with. And there's an understanding that should the MP not behave appropriately, they will not be chosen by another intern. And fortunately, that doesn't happen. But there is that connotation around intern, and certainly in 08-09, that was particularly strong. I also just think it's not accurate or appropriate to refer to somebody as a gift to an MP. It's an exchange. It's a relationship between the intern and the member of parliament and their staff. Often I find the MPs say, "Oh, I learned about all about this other region of the country because I had a chance to work. I'm an Alberta MP and I got to work with somebody from Nova Scotia. And now I know a lot about Nova Scotia, and I visited Nova Scotia." So I just don't think it's accurate. I don't think it's appropriate, and it's really misleading and troubling for people who are trying to gain this educational experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dance, and thank you for your contributions to this program and your expertise on Parliament as a workplace as well. Dr. Thomas, you mentioned limited access and that the opinion of the Conflict of Interest Commissioner did not achieve its desired gains. Can you please elaborate on that point, please?
Mr. Viss.
Through you, Madam Chair.
I would hope so. Dr. Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the honourable member for the question. I guess there's 2 points that I would make with this regard. If the goal is to diminish those placed at Parliament, or to increase transparency around who is placed with members of Parliament, using the existing mechanism of regulations on gifts creates 2 major problems. One, The commissioner's opinion focused extensively on a juxtaposition between paid interns and unpaid volunteers, without considering that intermediate category that Dr. Dance touched upon, which is the unpaid intern. So those who are systematically recruited, who are placed in specific MP offices, but who are unpaid. And even in the remarks to the committee, again, the commissioner's focus was on the salary paid. And so it creates a situation where certain organizations that might favor certain policy objectives could continue to place people with MPs despite this. The second challenge is that organizations that are advocating can continue to provide paid interns, provided that they don't register to lobby. And so, for example, GreenPAC is an organization that seeks to improve public policy around the environment through achieving greater proportion of environmental advocates in public office. It endorses candidates, but it does not register to lobby. It clearly has a public policy goal, but because it does not register, it's allowed to operate internship programs. And so whereas Equal Voice, which seeks to promote women in parliament, because it does register to lobby, it cannot run an internship program. And so you have these odd juxtapositions of transparency that are being placed through the use of the existing mechanism.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Madam Chair, do I have time for another quick question?
45 seconds.
Quickly, Dr. Thomas, the parliamentary internship program, they have sponsors, many from the private sector that work in conjunction with the Canadian Political Science Association. The Political Science Association is a nonpartisan organization that has broad respect across this country. Do you believe that that is an appropriate way for private sector companies to encourage youth participation in Canadian politics by working with such an organization?
Through the chair, Dr. Thomas, and a quick answer. And I would just say to Mr. Viss, Mr. Barrett is a master at going through the chair, so he might have some pointers.
Through the chair. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Dr. Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, I believe it is appropriate. I would point out that the Canadian Political Science Association has been there for those 52 years. The partnership was set up, and we also operate the same kind of program at the Ontario legislature. So having an independent body that is accountable to a board that ensures high academic standards, and I would also point out that is in both cases with the Ontario and the federal program is implemented jointly with the host legislatures to ensure that quality control.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. 6 minutes to Ms. Hoda.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you through you to the witnesses for their short but informative presentations and statements that they provided. I wanted to ask all the panelists, I guess, from what you've heard, which programs have, after this advisory was made public, which programs have been affected to your knowledge and which have not? Because the PIP program, as we know, has been able to continue. However, CEJA and a lot of other organizations have been impacted. So could you give me, can you shed some light as to how many internship programs have been affected?
Dr. Dance?
Thank you. I might defer to my colleagues here in that when this advisory opinion came out, it certainly took effort to clarify for the parliamentary internship program, which yes, because it's operated by the CPSA, I have an email here from the Commissioner's office confirming that it could continue to operate, but I'm afraid it was the 50th anniversary year of the program, and I was so consumed with that I perhaps didn't pay as much attention, so I will defer to my colleagues.
Dr. Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One challenge with the existing system is that there is no registry of how many internship programs are in operation. As part of that 50th anniversary program that Dr. Dance mentioned, I did research and tried to prepare a history of how the programs have operated, how it's spread. At that time, I identified around 15 internship programs that were in operation. They could be divided into different categories that were purely academic, some that were run by advocacy organizations, and then those like the Parliamentary Internship Program or the Jamie Anderson Internship Program that were operated by a specific external organization. The number of internship opportunities has declined. So the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs program was shut down. There previously was a Canada-Poland youth internship program that ended. There was also the National Council on Canada-Arab Relations program that ended. And there was the Parliamentary Internship and Mentoring Program that was run by the Korean Canadian Scholarship Foundation, which has ended. Exactly, part of the trouble, though, is I cannot attest that it was specifically due to this ruling, but they were in operation and are no longer, so far as I know, continuing.
Mr. Fogel.
Madam Chair, I would only add that we suspended our program immediately upon receiving the ruling, as did other groups like the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, the Canadian Tibet Committee, I think they call themselves. So there were a number, as Dr. Thomas suggested, that pulled back, seeking clarification, and then COVID hit. So, well, first an election, then COVID, and so it became a challenge addressing this in a sustained way.
Mr. Kofel, could you elaborate as to why this program was important for your youth? Because from the list that I've gotten so far, it seems to be a lot of different groups that represent ethnic minorities or other parts of the world or Canadian diasporas. So why is a program like this important to your organization? And perhaps maybe if you could elaborate on behalf of others as well. They're not what you would think of in terms of like the Girls and Boys Club or organizations that are there to promote opportunities for young people that you would typically think. But I understand, and I've had interns from some of these organizations that you may have similar motives.
Through the chair, Mr. Fogel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In response, through the chair, let me just make a couple of observations. I think communities like ours, and there are many in Canada, feel an imperative to make a contribution to the country, to encourage and foster a sense of not just belonging, but of meaningful contribution to the upbuilding of Canada through public service. It is not the most obvious path that people from marginalized or ethnic communities might choose. And they don't necessarily have easy or equal access to some of the programs that would encourage that kind of engagement. We feel that it reflects a core Jewish value to give back to community, and not in a parochial sense, in a much broader general sense. So for us, the value of the program is not what we accrue directly by way of benefit to us, but it's rather fostering a certain sense of commitment to Canada and to contributing to the public process.
Thank you. One more quick thing. Just wondering how, Dr. Dance, you had mentioned that this advisory may be making interns more vulnerable in the workplace. Can you elaborate on that?
Through the chair, Dr. Dance, quick.
Madam Chair, I appreciate that question. Very briefly, in theory, everybody working on the Hill is covered by certain policies and procedures. In my experience as the previous director and as an intern, I find that volunteers tend to have fewer supports, tend to have less training. This isn't the case consistently, but often if you're not paid, there's a certain lack of support, and that's troubling. And certainly the Hill can be a challenging place for young people to work. So I think the goal should be to ensure that as many people with as many supports as possible are on the Hill versus people without those supports.
Thank you, Dr. Dance. Mr. Terrien, 6 minutes à vous.
Merci. Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I wish to thank the witnesses for being here and acknowledge them. So, I have a question that comes to mind, Madam Chair, regarding the witnesses we heard last week, Ms. Mignolet and Mr. Wake. Ms. Mignolet was Commissioner of Conflict of Interest for Quebec and Mr. Wake for Ontario, and both of them seem to tell us that they have no problem with externally financed internships, either, or, well, call it the Quebec and Ontario commissioners, that is, Madam Chair. they came forward with these same statements. They both said the same thing. So this would tend to call into question why it's okay for the provinces, it's okay for Quebec, but for Canada it would raise a problem. So perhaps I could ask all three witnesses to shed light on this through you, Madam Chair. So we'll begin with Mr. Fogel.
Thank you very much. Look, Madam Chair, I'll invoke a comment of the late Herb Gray. I don't accept the premise of the question, not of the member who posed for the chair the question today, but the idea that at least the kind of internship that we provide, which is we argue fits into the category of a volunteer. It's an unpaid internship. Constitutes any kind of benefit or gift. In fact, oftentimes what we hear back from the public office holder is that it is more work for them than benefit that they gain from it. And because it is completely disassociated from our own activities, we only facilitate the program. We make no demands of the intern. There are no expectations either before, during, or after, and the benefit to the public office holder is at best minimal. More often than not at all.
Merci, Dr. Thomas.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And my apologies for applying in English. I'm using the translation feeds because I want to make sure I get the nuance. I would echo Mr. Fogel's remarks. The idea that interns are gifts misses the fact that the person in the being gifted, if I use that word, is a person who is gaining from this experience, that there is a goal to it. It is not simply to sway the opinion of a member. There's also public value in having more people learn about how politics works. And again, I would echo Mr. Fogel's remarks. And there is the workload on the member themselves to conduct this activity. What I would stress as well is that there is, I think, a consideration of lobbying that is not consistent with the way things have evolved. Recent changes in charity law have enabled more and more organizations to take part in government relations activities. And so engaging in public policy enables them to speak out to advance their goals through that mechanism. And so Boys and Girls Club, which I believe Ms. Sahota mentioned, would not be allowed at present to operate an internship program, given that they also are registered to lobby, the same with the Assembly of First Nations and so on. I can only have 10 interns per year. That's all I have funding for. And it's a very large and diverse country. And so I would hope that we can find more opportunities.
Thank you, Dr. Dance. Dr. Thomas. Dr. Dance.
Oui, merci, Madame Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the question.
Alors, quand j'ai reçu les...
So when I received the news about the advisory opinion, I asked my colleagues that manage this program in the other provinces at the Quebec National Assembly in Ontario and so on, whether they had the same thing in the other legislatures. And no, there are no rules like that. To me, it was very strange because our parliamentary internship program is very similar to the program at the National Assembly, and students with bursaries who write projects, who travel and study the legislature, and most of the work done by the internships is in the MP's offices or elected officials' offices, but they work on the research projects as well. So I tried to find what percent of their work is done in the MP's offices, and it's not 100%, of course, so it was difficult to get an understanding of it, but there are no similar rules in the provinces and other provincial internship programs. It doesn't apply to them. 40 seconds. Very briefly, I'd like to ask the question to Ms. Dance. Unfortunately, they were not able to systematically read their document, but I would just like to ask Ms. Dance if there's one thing that could be improved, one message to be kept, what should it be for us?
Dance.
Yes, well, I think that the interns are not gifts. I don't think it's appropriate. So I think that, that's one thing. And another thing is that the MPs or the people who are studying this have to think about accessibility of the programs and accessibility to the Hill for young people. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Merci. Madame Blaney.
Thank you. Ms. Blaney, 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And through you, I want to thank all the witnesses for being here and to deeply apologize that the way that we've structured ourselves meant you didn't get to read out your statements. I really think that is important, even if we can read them. I'm really fascinated by this discussion, and I'm going to come first to Dr. Dance. It's always good to see her. I've enjoyed our time together. But one of the things that you said in your write-up for us is that, in your view, the advisory opinion resulted in more unpaid people working for MPs, and just that concern of making sure that people have the resources and the protection when they're here in this very unusual work environment. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about the concerns that you have there and how this doesn't really address it. And I also will probably come to Dr. Thomas after that, because one of the things that really was interesting to me was the talk about no registry of intern programs. So if we're going to make a recommendation, how do we move forward with a recommendation that's really going to acknowledge how important it is to make sure that people who are working in this environment are protected, are paid? I think that's absolutely essential. I have real problems with free labor when people are working their butts off for us. And how can we sort of enrapture what all those programs are and how can we make a safe pathway so that young people can, I've had two young people from the PIP program, and man, I've learned a lot from them, and they've really opened my eyes and helped me get amazing projects done. They bring such energy and engagement. I just think that we need to have more diverse voices in this place, and one of those ways to do that is to open the doors in this particular way. So all of that together, if you could respond, I really appreciate it through the chair. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Dr. Dance.
Madam Chair, I really appreciate that question. So I think there are a lot of things to say around unpaid labor on the Hill, but I do think one of the things I found when I was director was I tried to widen the pool of applicants to the parliamentary internship program. We surveyed alumni from the last 10 years. We figured out where there were gaps, and we tried to really recruit and find ways to get more people to Ottawa. And one of the answers I found when I went to Saskatoon, when I went to Regina, when the interns did recruitment in different parts of Quebec that hadn't had good representation, people asked about the cost of living in Ottawa. They weren't asking about, oh, I'm from Alberta, I don't speak French, how can I do that? We figured out solutions. We offered them free second language training over the summer, but people were really worried about the cost of moving to Ottawa. And ours is a paid program for people who want to volunteer, who want to get that Hill experience, who maybe want to go into public policy or politics someday, but really want to see what it's like in Ottawa. They're just not able to do that. It's expensive. So I think when it comes to who gets to Ottawa, who gets these experiences, what I saw with the decrease of overall internships, paid internships, which anecdotally, that's my experience, but it sounds like Dr. Thomas and Dr. Fogel pointed to specific examples. I saw that there's still going to be the same demand in MP offices for that labor, for those people to come in and do work, which, that's great that people will do that, but they're probably going to be less representative of the country. There are probably going to be fewer people from the prairies. The prairies, we need to do more recruitment in the prairies always, but it's really expensive for them to think about doing that. So I think on paper, unpaid volunteers are still covered by all the measures on the Hill, but I've talked with colleagues who teach at universities in Ottawa, and they have volunteers who go in, and there isn't necessarily the same support, the same advice, the same knowledge of the Hill to sort of help steer them through the dynamics that they might encounter. So I guess that's the first answer, and I think I answered both of your questions, but I appreciate them. Through the chair.
So thank you for that, Dr. Dance. If I could just come to Dr. Thomas about, I really appreciate the work you did and recognizing there is no registry of intern programs and those pathways. And so I understand the commissioner is trying to measure outcomes from each office. And I agree, we should not be calling brilliant young people gifts. So I'm just wondering, with this work that you've done, looking at the lack of registry for intern programs, is there any recommendations about better pathways and different ways of using language as opposed to a gift of a human being?
I would strongly suggest that Parliament would benefit from some sort of registry with regards to what internship programs are operating. I think this relates to Dr. Dance's comment that it would be helpful to ensure interns have solid workplace experiences. And just to give a very practical example, I am usually contacted, and Dr. Dance before me, multiple times a year from people saying, oh, I need a reference from someone who was a parliamentary intern, or the House of Commons administration itself saying, we've been contacted by a parliamentary internship program. Is it one of yours? And because we are the largest, longest running program, we've become in some ways the de facto keepers of that knowledge as to which other programs are there. But it is challenging because some will come, some will go, and the standards vary greatly. There's also at times different extents of experiences promised that may or may not be delivered. There's American programs, the University of Michigan, University of Kentucky, that place interns at Parliament. What I would suggest as a potential model is what they do in the United Kingdom with what their all-party caucus system, where it's not saying who should be involved, but just that there needs to be a declaration that this exists, that there needs to be some recognition that if you are claiming to be an internship that places young people with MPs, that there is a place where you have to declare and also say what is the source of the funding, what other activities you have, and that way it would just greatly promote the transparency without necessarily putting House of Commons officials into being an arbiter necessarily of what kind of program is beneficial.
Thank you for that exchange. So now we'll enter into the second round, and just because time is limited, we will go through the first 4 speakers of the second round, starting with Mr. Duncan for 5 minutes, Mr. Fergus for 5 minutes, Mr. Terrien for 2 minutes et demi.
Mr. Terrien, 2.5 minutes.
2 minutes et demi. Mr. Duncan?
Madam Chair, I'm going to pass my time over to Mr. Morans, if that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan and Madam Chair. All my comments will be through you. As I'm listening to the conversation, I'm reminded of the saying that we hear a lot as parliamentarians, that we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And it strikes me that's exactly what's happened here. The Ethics Commissioner is of the opinion that the downside risk of the internship program outweighs the benefits of the program, and I respectfully disagree with that. Mr. Fogel, one of the things I found interesting is in the Belanger letter. The Belanger letter says that the Ethics Commissioner expressed his view that any intern services provided to members free of charge by a third party are benefits as defined in paragraph 3(1)(b) of the Conflict of Interest Code of members of the House of Commons. And now in the legal opinion, the Gowling's legal opinion that you obtained, it says that you had them look at that. And what they found was that the same section did not apply. It says, in fact, that the legal opinion found that CEGE's internship program did not place MPs in a conflict of interest under the code, under that same section, 3(1)(b). Defines a benefit as a service or property, or the use of property or money that is provided without charge or at less than its commercial value. But then in bold print in your submission, it says other than a service provided by a volunteer working on behalf of a member. You clarify in your remarks that the interns are not paid a salary. They are reimbursed for living expenses. And so I'm just wondering how we square that circle, because it seems to me if you take into consideration the Gowling opinion, it really is in stark contrast to the opinion of the Ethics Commissioner.
Madam Chair, through you, I thank the member for the question. I'll try and be very brief. When it comes to the issue of volunteers, it was a predecessor committee of yours, PROC, some years back, that excluded volunteer contributions from those things that could be understood as gifts or benefit to a public office holder. So it wasn't Gowling's interpretation; it was the House of Commons committee itself that made that distinction. But if I'm trying to understand Mr. Dion's struggle, I think that it goes back, Madam Chair, to some comments that both Drs. Dance and Thomas made. The idea of somehow achieving a degree of transparency and accountability for what takes place on the Hill, so that there's an ability to track, monitor, and evaluate. I would suggest, if I could, Madam Chair, that there is actually a very easy fix to this, much like is undertaken with respect to sponsored travel, which is exempt as well for its own compelling reasons. Having the participating members register the volunteer, including identification of the source of sponsorship, and publishing that every year would address the issue of transparency in a complete way.
1 minute, Mr. Morenz.
Thank you. Well, that was actually my next question, because I think the legal opinion, I think, is pretty clear that, with the greatest respect to Mr. Dion, his interpretation is incorrect. And the benefits of this program far outweighs, I think, any risk of any undue influence with respect to members of Parliament. But I do want to just suggest that the committee, I'm not on this committee, I was asked to sub in 5 minutes before it started, so I'm learning as quickly as I can. But if the committee would consider taking up Mr. Fogel's suggestion to have a specific stream for sponsored interns, I think we could right this ship and and start seeing the benefits of this program. Again, I know many people in my own community, not just in the Jewish community, because CJ interns are not just in the Jewish community, they're from the community at large, have benefited and gone on to have fabulous careers in politics and law and many other things. So the benefits of this program need to be reinstated and protected as we go forward. It's just a comment, Madam Chair. I don't have a further question. Thank you.
That was excellent. We welcome you to sub in or be part of this committee anytime. Thank you for your contribution. Mr. Fergus, 5 minutes to you.
Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I hope that you'll consider that all my questions go through yourself to our witnesses. I'd like to thank our witnesses for the presentation today. This is an issue, Madam Chair, in which I have to admit that I'm particularly interested in it, because when I had read the decision of the Ethics Commissioner, I myself, without having talked to anyone or the other groups concerned, that is, in the Parliamentary Internship Program, or CEJA, I made an appointment with the Ethics Commissioner to express my disagreement with his decision. I believe that it was not a correct interpretation and that it will prevent young people in Canada from getting up, especially young Canadians, from getting an opportunity to gain excellent experience on Parliament Hill, especially organizations such as the PIP or CEJA, where they do everything they can to make sure that their interns are nonpartisan. I think that is very important. And they have interns who do exceptional work, and those two groups are not the only ones. There are a number. So I would like to, well, normally I don't reveal the conversations that we have with people, but a piece of advice that the commissioner gave me is he said, you are a parliamentarian. You can change the legal framework if you wish to, and if you can persuade your colleagues to do the same. So my question to our witnesses is, what change should we make in the legislation to enable these kinds of activities that are clearly nonpartisan and that provide tremendous experience to young people? What kinds of changes should be made to the legislation before us? What changes should we make? Mr. Fogel, I know that you have to leave in 7 minutes. Mr. Fogel.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you to the member for his kind remarks. I think that if we go back to the core issue of transparency and accountability, we have our answer about what, as another member talked about, the path forward. Public office holders should receive. I mean, we should craft a handbook on internships for the benefit of all members of Parliament, so that they can be aware of the different issues of separation between whether it's a registered lobbyist or it's another special interest group, their activities and the expectations of the intern once she or he goes on the Hill. The issue of transparency, I think, is not a complicated procedure to enshrine and put into place. And with the rest of it, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We've been running an internship program for 20 years, PIP much longer, and they have worked wonderfully with great outcomes. And I can assure you, no benefit to us in terms of any kind of translated return from the MP. And it's almost insulting to think that the provision of an opportunity for an intern is going to skew the normal engagement of public office holders with their constituencies.
Thank you, Mr. Fogel. We're quickly running out of time. Dr. Thomas, et puis Dr. Dance.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think there could be, and I must confess not to be a lawyer, but some clarity that the services of an intern participating in a nonpartisan program would not be considered a gift would be helpful, that there could be a separate space created in the conflict of interest code for such items. And again, I cannot say that all programs have operated with equal effort to ensure that interns are not placed in awkward situations. There have been programs in past, and I can provide further research to the committee, where interns were expected to advance particular interests.
We would welcome those details to the committee as part of some of the information we consider. Thank you, Dr. Thomas. Dr. Dance.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the question. I think that clarity is very important. Clarity in the regulations that the interns are not gifts, and also clarity to know about all the different internship programs on the Hill, perhaps a registry, as Dr. Thomas described, something like that. But clarity is very important, and also training for the MP's assistants, because the assistants do a lot of work, and I think that it's a bit unusual that they don't receive that training. Thank you, Dr. Dance. And Mr. Terrien, 2.5 minutes for you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, listen, Mr. Thomas has a small paragraph that I'd like him to clarify. I know that he didn't have time to give his complete presentation, so I'd like to give him a moment to explain that to us. First of all, why he included this paragraph. I'd like him to explain that further, so I'll give him the floor for that. And secondly, I quote, secondly, a mechanism for monitoring these internships from 2018 is badly structured. It's difficult to figure it out for MPs as well as for those responsible for the initiatives. I'd like him to explain in his own words and also perhaps propose some solutions.
Dr. Thomas?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to respond to the question. I included that because of specific experiences that our host MPs have had where they were not aware that such a requirement existed. Where an intern was placed with a member of parliament. The member of parliament had read the conflict of interest code, which does not mention interns. The member was not aware that an advisory opinion had been issued because the advisory opinions had been removed from the commissioner's website. The only way I could find the actual text of the advisory opinion was to go to the Internet Archive and look at what the website looked like in 2018. And so we also have an additional challenge with the parliamentary internship program, given that it is delivered in partnership with the House of Commons. And so often members assume that it quite rightly, that perhaps we should not be covered in the same regard. Given that we have the direct support, the interns are written into the members' bylaw. And so there is a bit of confusion as to how we are both at the same time an external and internal program. So greater clarity, at the very least, just making it so that the advisory opinion is available to members to read would be a great first step. And then from there, having greater clarity as to what duties, I think Dr. Dance mentioned training, would be very helpful in this regard so that MPs, it's not reliant on the internship programs to educate MPs about it, and that those who might want to create a program, and this, I've been approached by several people, they had no idea of this because they couldn't find it either. So people could inadvertently contravene the guidelines.
10 seconds, Mr. Terrier.
10 seconds. How many interns per year, because of this 2018 rule, were not able to have an internship, according to you?
Dr. Thomas?
That is a precise number that I would not be able to give off the top of my head. However, I can say I believe the CJA program welcomed several interns per year, and they have been inoperative since 2018. I believe as well, as was mentioned, the Ukrainian program had 3 interns per year. The Tibetan program, I believe as well, 3 interns per year. And so it would be approaching 20 or more that have not been able to take part.
Merci.
Thank you. 2.5 minutes for Ms. Blaney. Over to you.
Madam Chair, and of course through you, I wonder if I could ask Mr. Fogel to just talk about the long-term impacts to his organization to not be able to have this program run. And I understand that there used to be a stipend that was included. So I think that's another part that's important to talk about the accessibility of these type of internships for members of our country, young people that may not have access to the resources to be able to participate.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll respond briefly. First, let me just for the record suggest further to Dr. Thomas's comment, we organize 10 to 12 interns per year. Others, as he suggested, have different numbers. We were able to both recruit and fund the stipends for 10 to 12, depending on availability. Through you, Madam Chair, let me say that our allowance for the individual interns really speaks to what Dr. Dance referenced earlier, which is ensuring a level playing field that everybody has access to across the country. We've had interns really from all provinces, all regions, and it is an extraordinarily expensive undertaking when one considers that Ottawa is not home, that they are coming specifically for this program. So it's not a long-term planning. It's not even schooling where one can project for 2, 3, or 4 years and make appropriate arrangements. It wasn't compensation. It was an ability to ensure that everybody had equal access to the program. And they responded well to that. I will conclude, though, that in addition, we have felt that it was part of our mandate to instill a sense of responsibility to community, to Canada, within our own constituency. And the Parliamentary Internship Program was a vital part of being able to translate that into something real.
Thank you. And that brings us to time. So I do, on behalf of all committee members, want to thank you, Mr. Fogel and Dr. Dance and Dr. Thomas, for joining us today. If you have any other information you'd like to submit for the committee to consider, please do not hesitate to submit that in writing directly to the clerk. With that, we hope you have a great day and thank you for your service. We will suspend the committee now for just about 2 minutes because we don't have to do all the sound checks, but they are ready, and we will start with the next panel at 12:25 on my clock, which currently reads 12:22. Thank you. Endeavor to end the meeting by 1 p.m. the normal time. So I would ask our guests today to keep your introductory comments to 30 seconds because we have received your submissions. And I would just remind members that we will most likely only get through the first round for 6 minutes each to each party to ensure that we respect everyone's time. So, donc, j'aimerais souhaiter la bienvenue.
So I wish to welcome our second group of witnesses, Ms. Catherine Stone, Ms. Mary Dawson, and Mr. Duff Conacher, who will each speak to the committee before the questions. Mr. Conacher, please proceed.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and Democracy Watch and the Government Ethics Coalition that it coordinates, which is made up of 30 citizen organizations from across Canada. welcomes the opportunity to present to the committee during this long overdue review of the code, with the hope that the committee will finally recommend key changes that will make the code effective in preventing and prohibiting conflicts of interest and unethical gifts and favors. Unfortunately, previous times the committee has reviewed the code since it was enacted in 2004, it has either added more loopholes or has done nothing to close loopholes or strengthen penalties and little to strengthen enforcement. Democracy Watch will file a written submission with the committee soon to give you all the details concerning its proposals for changes that I will summarize, hopefully, today in the brief discussion we're having, but may not even have a chance to do that, and the reasons why the changes need to be made. We'll also respond to the 6 recommendations of the Ethics Commissioner, some of which are flawed, and overall are much too weak. As in all areas of law reform, the devil is in the details. I'm sure we will not be able to cover all the details today, but I'm happy to be invited back to testify again to clarify or answer questions about any of the changes that Democracy Watch will recommend in its written submission. Overall, though, the MP code needs to be strengthened in several significant ways because it contains huge loopholes and flaws that in combination mean it really should be called the almost impossible to be in a conflict of interest code
Mr.
for
Conacher,
members of the House of
thank you
Commons.
for your comments, but as you'll get to know, I do try to run a really tight ship, and we welcome your submissions. Madame Stone, to you, quick, brief introductory comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm honoured to be invited to be with you today. Being elected brings enormous responsibility and huge privilege. It affords power and authority on those elected to change things for those who elected them. Using that power and authority for the greater good rather than personal gain is vital to preserve trust and confidence in the democratic process. Perhaps all parliamentarians should be made to ask why when they are offered something and what are you expecting in return. The code isn't simply a guide to work out who has done wrong. It must be an educative, informative document to enhance greater understanding of the expectations of what right looks like and what should happen. Standards matter, and how we reconcile our public and private lives matters too. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair, you're on mute.
Oh, fascinating. Sorry about that. Mrs. Dawson, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Well, first thing I want to say is the submission that I gave to the opening statement that I gave to the translation peoples, I've made some changes to that, and actually I found an error in one of my comments. So I would like to, it understood that I would like to replace that, and I'll do that this afternoon. I note that I was the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner for 10 and a half years. I was appointed as the first one under the Conflict of Interest Act in 2007. And the responsibility of the Commissioner is both the Conflict of Interest Act, which is public office holders, and the members under the Members Code. I noted in my submissions that 3 of the ones, first of all, I noted that 10 of my 23 submissions that I made in 2015 were accepted. And so I appreciate that. I also noted that 3 of the recommendations made by Mr. Dion repeat the ones that were, some of the ones that were rejected that I made previously. And I've got a few comments on some of the other ones. I guess the one that, of the other ones that Mr. Dion has suggested, I think the early mandatory training is a very good suggestion. We did have a regular practice anyway of discussing obligations with new members, but I think the regular mandatory training would certainly focus properly on that. And I think I will stop now because I've run out of time.
Thank you so much for recognizing our limited time and jumping on those issues, and we look forward to hearing more. We will now enter our first and only round of questions from each of the parties, starting with Mr. Duncan, followed by Mr. Turnbull, puis Mr. Terrien, et puis Madame Blaynis. Mr. Duncan, à vous la parole.
Mr. Duncan, over to you.
Through you, I thank you to our witnesses. Ms. Stone, I follow UK politics quite closely, and I've been interested. One of the topics that our Ethics Commissioner has asked us to discuss and look at in our review is extra employment income or other work by members of Parliament. I understand this is quite an issue that you are and in the UK government are struggling with right now. Could you give us a background or perhaps a quick summary of the issue and where you see some of those conversations or new rules are going regarding extra work by members of Parliament who are elected?
Certainly. Through you, Madam Chair, I'd like to thank my colleague for the question and say those of you who have watched events in Westminster will note that we've experienced some turbulence of late, and that's probably an understatement, but it's all linked to standards matters and behaviour around the registration of financial interest and additional roles in particular. We are currently, as are you, in the process of reviewing our code of conduct and trying to establish whether, for example, it should be a limitation of hours that members of Parliament can work in other roles, or a limitation on the amount of money that can be earned. And actually, the consensus seems to be falling around whether or not there is a conflict of interest. And of course, these questions arise out of the case of Owen Paterson MP, who was found by the committee agreed with my conclusion that he had been lobbying on behalf of an organisation who paid him. So these questions are very live and very real for us at the moment. And the conflict of interest point is very, very important. And of course, the line between what's acceptable, what isn't, what's public and private shifts and sways as we go through. But I'm sure it's a live interest for you too.
For sure, thank you. And just for a context of the 650 members of Parliament in the UK, do you have an estimation on the number that make a supplemental income for work hours or income? Do you have a certain number that declared to you already how many would have that?
Okay. If we just say through the chair, I'll stay quiet. Heads up, Ms. Stone.
Okay, through you, Madam Chair, we concluded recently that there are about 189 members of Parliament who have additional roles. Some of those roles include working in accident and emergency departments in hospitals, working as nurses, working as social care workers throughout the pandemic. Many other MPs have additional income, small amounts that come from completion of surveys for public opinion polls and so on. But certainly it's something that we are looking at across the piece in the House of Commons to ensure that we address the conflict of interest point. And for me, if you earn more money and spend more time on an additional role, then being a member of Parliament becomes your secondary role rather than giving a primary consideration to the people who elected you to be a member of Parliament.
And if I could ask the same question of Ms. Dawson and her view, as she does outline this in her submission about needing to tackle this issue, perhaps, any advice that you would have or say? I note here that you leave to the assessment of the committee, but from your experience, are you finding this a growing problem in Canada with extra income by members of Parliament or other jobs they take?
Sorry, I missed your first question. I wonder if you could just repeat it basically.
Just getting your views from your experience in your time in the office. Were you finding this a growing problem for members of Parliament having supplemental work and a growing conflict of interest in that work? Any experience you would have from your time as Commissioner would be appreciated.
Well, I'm not clear on what supplementary work you're talking about. I'm sorry.
If somebody would have extra income from another job, for example, they practiced law on the side, they were a real estate agent.
Right.
Did you have a lot of experience with that in your time, and do you see that as a growing problem?
I never had a huge amount of problem with that. I think the suggestion that Mr. Dion has made is that they have to get his approval before they, so they're effectively reversing the onus of proof there. As to whether a member can be involved. And I think that may create a problem for some members in certain circumstances. If they have, if to keep a job, you have to do it quickly or something. But I understand that one must be very careful that there are not conflicts between the time taken by the other outside activities. I'm sorry I missed that point the first time, but that's my general opinion.
Thank you. And Ms. Dawson, to you as well. I just want to have your view on the definition of friends. And this is something I think we've struggled with in hearing and trying to define as best as possible or as detailed as possible. It's one thing to list family and family relations and so forth. There are some complications with that. But again, friendships and the definition of friends and what constitutes that and timetables. Can I just get your views on that, of trying to define that? Is that possible, or how do we get that balance, understanding where the issue comes from, but the openness or the interpretation of that being a real challenge, perceived or legal or otherwise?
You know, that's a fun question, because actually early on in my time as commissioner, maybe the first couple of years, I had occasion in one of my reports to try and figure out whether somebody was a friend or not. And I submitted a general description of what a friend is, and it included ideas like having mutual regard beyond mere association. You know, there's a paragraph, you'll find it in one of my early judgments. And the interesting thing about that is it's been picked up across the country by various provinces. And I think the current office continues to use that as a general approach. So you know, the other anecdote there perhaps with respect to friends is I had a one case way back where a person was going around saying he was a great friend to some other guy. And the case turned on whether he was a friend, and I actually found that he was only an acquaintance. But I think that definition is not a bad one, and it seems to have stood the test of time in large measure and been used. So it's worth digging that one up. I've forgotten, I can't quote it exactly.
Thank you, Madam Dawson. And if you have any details on the difference between a friend and an acquaintance, I'm sure the committee would welcome those definitions. Mr. Turnbull, to you, 6 minutes.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks to all of our witnesses for being here today. It's really great to hear your remarks. I did read over the things that were sent in advance, so although you didn't get time to lead with your opening remarks here on the panel, I can assure you that most of our members are probably reading those. So thank you for submitting those. I will say off the hop that I do really appreciate Mr. Dion's recommendations, and I definitely agree with mandatory training for new MPs and publishing guidelines. I think those are really good recommendations. Some of the other ones I have some concerns with. That's not to say that I'm not supportive, but I have a lot of questions about. One of them is the minimum threshold for gifts in a single year. And I note that in looking at Ms. Stone, through you, Madam Chair, Ms. Stone, I looked at the UK version of the Code of Conduct, I guess, and I understand that in the UK it's £300. And so, you know, our commissioner in this case is, you know, suggesting that we reduce the amount from $200 Canadian to $30. I just can't for the life of me see how, you know, the difference between $200 and $30 is going to be the difference in terms of, you know, essentially influencing an MP's decision-making or behavior. Would you comment on that, Ms. Stone, through you, Madam Chair, sorry?
Thank you. And through you, Madam Chair, I'd be very, very happy to respond. The £300 limit was set so as to deliberately exclude those gifts that are given by grateful constituents, bunches of flowers, boxes of chocolates, a homemade cake, and so on. And there are many, many occasions when constituents will insist on a Member of Parliament having a small token gift. And it seems to us that it would be inappropriate to register those because people would be constantly falling foul of the requirement to register a very small token gift. That's why the limit was set as it is. Now, the interesting thing, of course, in the UK is that our ministers have a different requirement to register things, and there are different levels of registration. And one of the things that we have said that we'd like to do in our Code of Conduct review, forgive me, the Committee on Standards would like to do, is to streamline that. So there aren't two registers, there aren't different requirements for ministers and for members of Parliament. But forgive me for being so candid. I think it would be very challenging for members of your Parliament to be continually registering small token gifts of $30. That seems to be a lot of work for very little return, and the opportunities to influence the words or actions of a member of Parliament for a bottle of wine or a bunch of flowers seem quite small.
Thank you. I do agree with your sentiments, but maybe Ms. Dawson, I could go to you on this. I know you said in your remarks that I read through that the general kind of practice within your office when you were the commissioner was to consider $30 gifts as being ones that would not have any influence over a member. I still have trouble understanding why 30, why 50, why no gifts at all. And, you know, to me, I mean, I think most of these things, I mean, the true test, is it not to, like, what is the actual likelihood of that influencing a member of Parliament's, you know, fulfillment of their duties? And I don't see how 30 versus 50 versus 200 would make that much of a difference, to be honest. So could you comment on that? Through the chair.
I mean, I think you've missed the point a little bit here, although I'm not sure I agree with the necessity of actually expressing the $30 as a minimum. What I said in my opening remarks, which weren't supposed to be divulged until later, but in any event, the reporting requirement is $200, and so those issues get looked at once they're reported. The $30 is something that the office has followed for many years, in a sense that it was kind of a rule of thumb that if something was under $30, it's probably not going to create a conflict of interest. So I think that the desire to put in the $30 on the part of Mr. Dion was partly to distinguish it from the rule of the $200, which is a disclosure rule. So you can't confuse those rules. But the fact of the matter is, like, people, in the decisions we made over the years, we, for example, said if you went for an all-day meeting with somebody and they gave you a gift of a lunch, in other words, they served you lunch in the middle, that wasn't going to be a problem because it was normal etiquette and stuff. So the reason why we were looking at $30 in my time, and undoubtedly that practice has continued, I don't know, is just as a guideline to people that, you know, of course, if there's a legitimate reason for offering something to somebody, $30 is a reasonable amount to kind of consider as reasonable, if that helps at all.
Well, I mean, I would just say thank you for your response through you, Madam Chair. I still don't see how the rationale, you know, where to draw the line exactly.
No.
But I understand that you consider that reasonable. I'm still not sure how the rest of us would determine that, and it may be slightly subjective, to be honest.
Yeah. Can I just add to that? I mean, the point is that when I'm not sure I support putting a rule into the code. I just say that it reflects a practice which we followed anyway, of sort of at first blush assuming that it was probably okay under 30, when people worried about whether they could give somebody a lunch or something, you know. Anyway, I'm not sure it needs to go into the the code myself.
Thank you, Madam Dawson. Thank you, Mr. Turnbull.
And now, over to you, Mr. Tarian. 6 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I wish to acknowledge the witnesses who have come to give us their remarks. Mr. Conacher, first of all, he didn't speak for very long, but he had time to say that there were a lot of loopholes which appeared to he has observed, and he also talked about the important role of MPs' assistants. I'd like to ask him some short questions, Madam Chair. First of all, the main loophole that he sees in the code of ethics that we have, first of all, and secondly, when you talk about the role of the MP's assistants, if he could please tell us more about that.
Mr. Conacher? You are on mute, Mr. Conacher.
Thank you for the question, and because of the number of technical terms, and also because I need to practice my French, I will answer in English. I hope that's okay with you. The definition of private interest is the huge loophole in subsections 3.2 and 3.3 of the code. 3.2 says it's only financial interests that are covered. 3.3 says you cannot be in a conflict of interest if you're dealing with a matter of general application or dealing with something that applies to you as an MP, and in the same way it applies to other members of the public. This allows MPs to participate in almost all decisions and actions, even when you have a secret financial conflict of interest, and will profit secretly from the decision or action, or your family members will profit from it, or friends, and friends should be covered in the code in terms of their private interests and you having to avoid conflicts of interest. And the reason for that is 95% of the decisions and actions that MPs are involved in are matters of general application. And it's a huge loophole. Secondly, the code doesn't even apply to MP staff, to answer your second question. And so they can do the very few things on behalf of their MP that the code actually prohibits MPs from doing, and it's only very few. It's only 5% of your decisions and actions that are even covered by the code. And staff can then do those things for you that you're prohibited from doing because they're not covered by the code. Staff should be covered by most of the key rules of the code. And there's many other loopholes I wish I had time to talk about in the code that make it almost impossible to be in a conflict of interest code.
Mr. Terrien.
Mr. Terrien, thank you for the answer. I would have liked to ask a question of Ms. Dawson about the $30. We talked about the $30 in 2015. Now we're still talking about $30 in 2022. And you know, as I do, that there's inflation. I would simply like to ask a question as an economist. Why are we still talking about $30? Shouldn't it be reviewed upward? That's my first question. My second one, because I have another. What bothers us in this is that when we talk about the same source, I'll just try to find it, excuse me. Shouldn't we specify more clearly the source from which this gift comes? Because it seems very broad, and this causes a problem for us. Thank you. The provenance.
Okay, listen, for some reason, I'm not on translation there for the English, which I had asked for, but I understood the question, I think. But if that could be fixed, it would be good. With respect to the $30, I also tend to be nervous about putting that into the code because it's going to change over time. And you know, what $30 is today isn't what it is in 5 years. And I just noted that at the time I was there, we used to sort of think, well, around $30 is probably okay. But it wasn't a definite rule, and it was just an approach and trying to decide whether something was really going to create a conflict of interest or be an improper gift. So I guess that's my comment. And your second question, I've kind of lost track of what that was. Was it
La provenance? The provenance of the gifts. In other words, there can be a number of gifts given, but how do you define who they come from or what the provenance is?
Well, I guess one just has to use one's common sense to figure it out. I'm sorry, that's not defined, and but normally you can figure out where the gift has come from, and anyway, that would be a matter you'd have to establish if it was looked into more carefully. But I think it's just something that has to be dealt with.
Second, Mr. Terrien.
So for Ms. Stone, a brief question. It's impressive the number of MPs you have that have more than one job. It's quite surprising. You said that one of the basic problems related to that is that there may be a dilemma about the priority that those MPs place on their work. But over and above that, can it cause another problem? And if so, which? Because you face that situation, really. What are the other problems that you have experienced following the accomplishment of a second paid job?
Madam Chair, may I thank our colleague for the question and say there are a number of issues that arise from that. And one of them is the perception of constituents that the Member of Parliament is not representing them fully because their priority is with the role that is paying them more than their Member of Parliament salary, and they're devoting more hours than they are to their Member of Parliament's duties. However, there is no job description for a Member of Parliament. There is no set number of hours that a person must contribute to that. And my colleagues who are Members of Parliament would tell me that it is a 24/7, 365-day a year role, and therefore having additional roles on top of that must be quite complex and challenging. And again, I would like to go back, if I may, to the purpose of the register. And it's about whether those actions, whether the interests, second jobs, third jobs, or gifts, hospitality, might reasonably be thought by others to influence the actions of a Member of Parliament. And it's that conflict of interest point that is so key to understanding the extent to which Members of Parliament should and do get themselves involved in other roles. Some of them are very important public service roles, some of them are roles that they have to undertake to maintain their continuing professional development. Others bring in large sums of money, acting on behalf of companies that benefit from their parliamentary knowledge, skill and experience.
Donc, merci, Madame.
Thank you, Ms. Stone. Thank you, Mr. Therrien. And now, 6 minutes. Over to you, Ms. Blaney.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And of course, as always, through you, I would like to ask the witnesses here questions and thank them all for their time. I really appreciate it. If I could start with Mr. Conacher, you talked a lot about huge loopholes. You gave us one brief example. You also indicated that you're going to be getting us some information soon. So I guess my first question to you, and I'll give you a couple. The first question is, when is that information coming? I look forward to seeing it. And the second question is, you indicated that you had some concerns with Mr. Dion's recommendations. I'm just wondering if you could outline which ones are the most concerning to you?
Thank you very much for the question, and through you, Madam Chair. The Democracy Watch's position is that we agree with Mr. Dion's 6 general recommendations and 9 technical recommendations generally. However, with regard to the recommendations on gifts, he has proposed that each lobbyist essentially should be allowed to give a $30 gift annually to each MP. And the way this is phrased, and it may be a mistake by the Ethics Commissioner, this means that a big business could have each of its lobbyists, as well as each of its board members and employees, buy a $30 gift for each MP, which would add up to hundreds of dollars of gifts annually, likely mainly in the form of wining and dining. Given that testing of tens of thousands of people around the world by psychologists in every country has shown that even small gifts and favors influence decisions, the current Section 14 gift rule should be changed instead to prohibit MPs and their staff from accepting any gifts or hospitality from anyone or any entity that has an interest in any federal government decision or action, or that communicates or will communicate with an MP or staff in respect of any of their decisions.
Can I do a point of order? I need to hear what the witness is saying, and people in this room are speaking. So I'll leave that to you, Madam Chair. I know you're not here to monitor that, but that is happening. So hopefully the witness can continue.
This is your time, Ms. Blaney. So if that's what you would like, you're permitted that. Please keep it quiet in the room.
Thank you. With regard to recommendation 4 of the Ethics Commissioner restricting sponsored travel, the Ethics Commissioner at the end of his section says this would still allow an MP to be sponsored to travel to speak at a conference. That's a huge loophole. All it means is that all the lobby groups that are now giving MPs junket trips overseas, and their families sometimes and associates, which is all legal under the Section 15 huge loophole that never should have been in the code and is essentially a form of legalized bribery. All it would mean is those trips would turn into speaking events for MPs. So Section 15 should have been removed years ago. It should just be removed now. It's a form of legalized bribery, and the sponsored travel loophole, among many other loopholes, needs to be closed. And I will be making the written submission in the next couple of days, which will give you all the details of the dozen or so key changes that Demarc Suach and the Government Ethics Coalition are recommending to turn the code into an actual conflict of interest code for members of the House of Commons instead of what it is now, which is an almost impossible to be in a conflict of interest code that also allows MPs and their staff to accept all sorts of unethical gifts and favors and essentially practice favor trading.
Well, thank you so much for that testimony. I'm wondering if I can go to Dr. Stone now. You know, one of the things that we are getting some recommendations from our current commissioner is around identifying clearly what friends and family means, and of course, work that parliamentarians may take outside of the role. I guess, so two things. The first one around friends specifically is there criteria of what that is? That seems like an odd thing to measure and may be unclear. And the second part about work outside of your parliamentarian duties, I'm just wondering, is there any difference between if you had a position or a role prior to being elected, and then if you add a role after you are elected? Hopefully that is clear. Thank you, Madam.
Madam Chair, I'm very, very happy to answer those questions. And to go to the second part of your question first, there is no distinction currently. And with respect to your first question, in respect of friends and the distinction between friends and others, I think it's really, really important. And it goes back, and forgive me for sounding like a broken record, but it is about the interests that reasonably might be thought by others to influence the actions of a member of parliament. And there's also a different, broader point I'd like to make in response to that question, which is entering into public service means you put the public interest ahead of your own private interests. And thinking about the perception of the influence of friends, of acquaintances, is a really, really important part of that. It's not something I'm aware that we consider specifically, although members do register under miscellaneous anything else that might be considered to influence their thoughts or actions. And we do give advice on that frequently. The Registrar of Members' Financial Interests gives advice frequently to members of Parliament on those issues.
And my last question to you, Dr. Stone, is just around the reality that there is gifts given, but there is a particular nuance, especially for some ethnic communities. And I just wonder how that's recognized in the work that you do.
Okay, thank you again through the chair for your question. And what I would say is that the gift relationship is very, very important. And I know that for many constituents from a whole range of backgrounds, it's hugely important for them to be able to symbolically show their gratitude to members of Parliament. But again, how does that influence the actions of a member of Parliament? And, you know, all of us will have those complicated and sometimes awkward conversations when people want to give us things and we feel awkward about receiving it. But if we register that and are transparent about that, but where people are sincerely and genuinely wanting to express their thanks for something that a member of Parliament has done for them in their role as a member of Parliament, I'm not confident that that becomes a conflict of interest. That becomes part of a gift relationship and something that it would be extremely rude and discourteous not to accept from that constituent.
I thank you for those comments, and I really do also want to thank you for joining us from so far away at this time. And it means a lot, and I know within my culture as well that it comes into accepting gifts, and sometimes it's very offensive to not do that. So definitely a lot of dimensions to the conversation today. To Mr. Conacher and to Madame Dawson as well, thank you for taking the time. To committee members, I know we've gone a minute or two over, but I think we've done well today. And I will just remind witnesses again, if you have any submissions, the clerk will be sending you an email so that we can stay tight on the timeline and do this very important work. So with that, I hope everyone keeps well and safe. I thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to doing this important work, all of us together. Take care. Meeting adjourned.